Spin the bottle, Carly, Michael said. It's your turn. Carly and Michael were in the basement of Carly's house, along with Cole, Harrison, Nancy, and Samantha. Carly's basement was the neighborhood's premier hangout spot because her parents frequently went out on the weekends and didn't get home until late. Carly placed her hand on the empty wine bottle that was laying on the floor between them. She was about to spin it, but stopped when she heard footsteps on the floor above her. Everyone got real quiet and stared at the ceiling. I thought your parents weren't supposed to be home until later, Cole whispered. They're not, Carly replied. Then who is that? He pointed his finger at the ceiling. Carly shrugged. Maybe it's that psychopath who murdered those kids over in Atwood, Nancy blurted out. Why would you think that? Michael asked. Atwood is like 100 miles from here, he suggested. The lights suddenly went out. Oh my God, Nancy yelped, reaching out to grab hold of Harrison's arm. Chill out, Harrison tried to calm her. It's probably just a blown fuse. Come on, Cole, Michael said. Let's see what's going on. As the two boys stood up, the basement door creaked open, revealing the silhouette of a person standing in the doorway. Mr. and Mrs. Eaton stood in the doorway, looking down into the basement. I swear I heard voices down there, Mrs. Eaton said. Stay right here, Mr. Eaton said. I'll go down and check it out. He quickly descended the basement steps and looked around. There's nobody down here, he declared a moment later. Mrs. Eaton descended the steps. I think you're just letting your imagination get the best of you, Mr. Eaton said, which is understandable given the horrible story the neighbor told you. Do you believe them? Mrs. Eaton asked. Do you think a group of kids were murdered in this basement while playing Spin the Bottle 40 years ago? No, I don't, he sighed. I think the neighbor was just trying to scare you. You're probably right, she said. Mrs. Eaton turned to leave and accidentally kicked something with her foot. When she looked down to see what it was, she saw an empty wine bottle spinning across the floor. Then the lights suddenly went out. My husband snores like a freight train. For 3 difficult years, I have not got a decent night's sleep. It doesn't matter what I tried. Earplugs, melatonin, nothing helped. When I suggested we sleep in different rooms, my husband refused to even consider it. Married couples are supposed to sleep in the same bed. Arguing with my husband was like trying to knock down a brick wall using your head as a battering ram. He didn't care that I could barely function at work, or that I was nodding off in traffic. He only cared about his traditional view of marriage. Husbands and wives sleep together, even when they snore. I wanted to rip my hair out. At the advice of a friend, I tricked my husband into participating in a sleep study, and the doctor told us what I suspected for years. My husband had severe sleep apnea, which meant as long as my husband used a CPAP machine, his snoring would stop. I could finally get a decent night's sleep. The mask is uncomfortable. I'm not sleeping with that on. Jesus fucking Christ. I reminded him that if he didn't, then his risk of having a stroke would skyrocket. Like I care. I mentioned that it was possible that he could literally die. I'll die happy in my sleep. I finally snapped and said that I would divorce him if he refused, and do you know what he said? I'd never let you do that. I packed my things and went to spend the night at my mother's, and gave him the ultimatum: wear the CPAP or lose me. He could take the night to think it over. I returned the next morning after a restless night's sleep. I've taken steps to prevent our divorce. I asked my husband if that meant that he decided to wear the CPAP. Of course not. Yesterday, after I left for my mother's, he drained our joint bank account and put the money into a new account that only he could access. Unless you want to be homeless, you're stuck with me. I was being held hostage in our marriage. That night, my husband begrudgingly put on the CPAP mask to appease me for giving him the silent treatment. Just for tonight, and if I don't like it, I'm throwing it away. I knew he was going to throw it away regardless. Fortunately, he fell asleep fast and hard thanks to the CPAP. I quietly took out the CPAP's reservoir and poured out the distilled water. Then, I filled up the reservoir halfway with bleach and halfway with ammonia. I shook it up and put it back in the machine. Once my husband stopped convulsing, I emptied the reservoir and placed it outside in our garbage can. In the morning, after the garbage truck had come, I'd call for an ambulance. I'd tell them he must have stopped breathing in his sleep. I laid down in bed and got the best night's sleep of my life. When I was young, my mother brought me a dog to help cope with the loss of my father. My parents never married and broke up before I was born, so my relationship with my father was almost non-existent. He died when I was 6 years old. Looking back, my father was a horrible person and a complete deadbeat father, but like almost every other kid, I still admired him despite the horrible way he treated my mother and I. It makes me sick to think that he was my hero, but he was. When he eventually died of an accidental drug overdose, I was an emotional wreck. I refused to leave my room when I wasn't forced to, and I cried nearly every night for weeks on end. It was incredibly painful. All of that for a man that never called, never sent a letter, never messaged, and never visited despite my strong attempts to bring him back into my life. My mother, feeling totally helpless in this situation, decided to get me a dog. That was the best decision she ever made for me. The dog she chose was perfect. His name was Duke. He was a beautiful brown and white pit bull. He was the smartest, dopiest, funniest, most caring dog I ever had the pleasure to meet in my life. He was just what I needed in that time in my life, and to be completely honest, he needed me too. He was rescued from the streets, believed to have run away from his previous family. We quickly realized that he had an affinity for unrestricted adventure and liked to escape at any chance he had. As they say, curiosity killed the cat. I used to go camping a lot as a child. Nearly every night I wasn't sleeping over at Corbin's house, I was most likely to go outside and sleep in the woods. My woods were huge. I had the whole world in my backyard. My childhood was phenomenal in that regard. I had free range of the woods around my house as long as I was inside either the house or my tent before it got too dark. There were many times where Corbin and I would camp out on our sleepovers at my place. It was amazing. Most of our nights camping had the same sort of schedule. We would play for several hours, set up our tent before it got too dark to see. Sometimes we started a fire for s'mores. We would usually tell stories to scare each other, and eventually kind of went to bed if we weren't busy discussing the world's biggest issues, such as why Squirtle was the best starter Pokemon, and what shape of McDonald's nuggets tastes the best. He always said that the Bell Nugget tasted the best, and I would stand strong in my position that the boot was always the best. We would wake up the next morning, go inside, and eat some toaster waffles as we watched some cartoons. At least, that's what we would do until Corbin moved away. He lived in town, but it was significantly harder to see him unless one of our parents drove us to each other's house. As the years went on, these camping trips became less and less frequent until they eventually stopped altogether. There's one trip that sticks out to me specifically. It was our last camping trip. We were probably around 10 or 11 years old when we embarked on our last campout. The setup for everything was normal. We played for a while, set up our tents, and talked about nothing and everything all at once. That night, we decided we were going to try and scare each other with whatever scary stories our little minds could conjure up. I remember his story being about Jesus Christ rising again to kill vampires, while mine was about an evil space llama that crash-landed on Earth to destroy human life. Both stories were extremely stupid, but they scared the living daylights out of us. After our failed attempts at being a young Stephen King, we tried to go to sleep. Anyone who has ever been camping understands that nature makes noise at night. The occasional rustling leaves, sticks snapping, or maybe just the wind blowing. Sometimes you'll even hear animals howling or something. That night, the woods were especially loud, as if the entirety of nature was stomping outside our tent. It was nearly impossible to sleep. All of our attempts to scare away whatever animal was out there failed. We would bang something in the tent or yell a little bit, but the incessant rustling would continue and get louder and closer. We were already a little jumpy because of our own scary stories that sounded like the plot of a B-tier horror movie. Every single little sound would send us into a frenzy. We decided that we were not to check it out. We thought we were overreacting and that maybe it was a raccoon or a deer or something, so we decided to go to sleep. We brushed our teeth and went to bed. After what felt like only a few minutes, we were thrust back into consciousness. We thought that it was probably something that had been scraping our tent. We slowly opened the door of the tent to see absolutely nothing. We shined our flashlights to potentially see some animal eyes, but there was nothing. Unlike earlier, the woods were a ghost town. Corbin and I decided to try and stay up, but that was easier said than done. We had gotten to the point where we were so tired that we were just absolutely miserable and didn't even want to see each other. We were too tired. No matter how much we tried, we could not stay awake. We fell asleep. We later woke up to some more aggressive rustling and to a breeze. Our tent door was open. Neither one of us remembered leaving the door open, but thought that maybe one of us forgot to close it earlier in the night the first time we woke up. We zipped it back up and went back to sleep. I remember my dreams that night being very strange. Every dream that I had that night had something to do with me being watched or stolen. It was very strange. I should have listened to my dream. The next time I woke up, I wasn't next to Corbin. I wasn't in my tent. I wasn't in the woods at all. I had no actual idea where I was. I remember the room being very dark, to the point that I needed to navigate the room by feel. Each time I touched a wall, I felt dirt fall on the floor. I was underground. I began to panic. I started pacing back and forth, tripping on something new each time. I began to hyperventilate. It was terrifying. I felt totally helpless, and I began to cry. Struggling to think through my hysterical tears, I began to feel the wall again in hopes of finding a gap or stairs or something. I only found dirt. I attempted to navigate towards the middle of the room, and again found nothing. I jumped in hopes of finding a ledge or something, thinking that maybe this was just a big hole rather than a room. If it was, then the walls were too tall. I laid back down on the ground and cried myself to sleep, hoping that this was all a sick dream, but believing that my life was over and I was waiting to die. When I woke up again, it was daylight, and I was back in the tent. My clothes were caked in dried mud, and the tent was ripped to shreds. Poles were broken, stakes were bent, the whole tent was in utter shambles. Corbin was gone. I went back inside to see if he was there, and it turns out that he had decided he was going to sleep inside, due to all the noise and commotion that night. I told him about the tent and the dream, and he began to look very worried and scared. I asked him what was wrong, but he said not to worry about it. I dropped the matter. I still haven't told my mother about it, and every time I try to bring up the topic, she shuts it down really quickly. She never wants to talk about my childhood. I understand why, but I feel as if I've earned the right to know what happened. I hope this doesn't put my otherwise healthy relationship with my mother in jeopardy. If I lost her, I truly don't know what I would do.